Port Oswald is not alive. Its lungs are filled with smoke and silence. Here, breath is a struggle, and silence is a warning. In this city of shadows, one man waits. They call him the Shadow Collector. And tonight, his archive grows. Welcome to Unclosed, where stories begin but never truly end. Tonight, I'll tell you a story you've never heard before. Port Oswald does not breathe like other cities. It wheezes. It is a place where the very concept of oxygen feels like an afterthought, replaced by a thick, suffocating mixture of coal dust, oxidized iron, and the briny, decaying stench of the Atlantic. To walk its streets is to enter the lungs of a dying Victorian beast. The air is so heavy with the factory breath, that jaundiced sulfuric mist, that you can almost taste the history of every failed ambition and every broken heart that ever sought refuge within its soot-stained walls. The Atlantic doesn't merely touch the docks of Port Oswald, it assaults them. It presses in with the relentless force of a cold, wet shroud, dragging with it the smell of rotting kelp and the ghosts of ships that never found their way home. Here, silence is a commodity, but it is never a sign of peace. Silence is a hell breath. It is the agonizing, clinical quiet that exists in the split second before a landslide buries a village, or the terrifying stillness that follows the final, jagged breath of a murder victim. The streets of the city are narrow, jagged veins of soot, winding like a labyrinth through a carcass of stone and timber. The cobblestones are permanently slick, coated in a shimmering, iridescent film of oil and grease that reflects the jaundiced glow of the gas lamps. These lamps do not illuminate. They merely flicker and buzz with the desperate energy of trapped hornets, their pale light swallowed by the fog long before it can reach the mud-caked ground. Even the gulls, those once white symbols of freedom, have been claimed by the smog. Their cries are no longer calls to the sea. They are ragged, metallic coughs. Their wings, heavy with tar and industrial grime, beat against the air with a sound like wet leather striking stone. In the taverns, those dim, airless chambers where the walls are stained the deep, sickly color of old tobacco, the atmosphere is a thick soup of smoke and collective desperation. The men who gather there do not tell stories to pass the time. They tell them as a form of survival. They speak in low, gravelly whispers that harmonize with the rhythmic, agonizing creak of the rusted cranes outside on the docks. Their shanty is a heritage of horror, a rhythmic warning passed down through generations like a genetic defect. The sea takes the body. The fog takes the mind. But the jarman, he takes what's left behind. This song is never sung with a melody that a human ear would find comforting. It is muttered as a half-remembered prayer, a desperate cadence designed to keep the mind from unraveling into the gray void outside. In Port Oswald, children learn the rhythm of this fear before they learn the letters of their names. Women hum it while scrubbing the relentless, black soot from their window panes, a futile attempt to maintain a clarity that the city is determined to erase. Silence here is not an absence. It is a memory, muted by the sheer force of the city's will. The founding charters of 1842, written on parchment that still smells of sulfur and ash, warned the first settlers, silence is not stillness. It is an archive. Jackson Ryder was not a mistake of this environment. He was its crowning achievement. He was the city's final, logical form, the architect of its darkness. His lineage was a map of human endings. He was descended from undertakers who knew the weight of cold earth, stonecutters who carved finality into granite, and men who looked at the dead and saw only a resource. His grandfather, Silas Ryder, was a man of such profound coldness that he famously described the beating human heart as nothing more than an inconvenient vibration. His father, Thomas, had been a zealot of industry, a man who worshipped the permanence of steel and the unyielding logic of the machine, declaring human flesh to be a pathetic design failure. Jackson grew up in a house on the cliff that was less a home and more a museum of husks. Inside, the air was always still, as if the wind itself were afraid to enter. The walls were lined with birds pinned to velvet boards, their glass eyes staring into an eternal vacuum, their wings frozen mid-flight by the careful application of arsenic, wire, and obsession. He learned at an age when other children were playing in the sun that the human body is merely a cage, a temporary, leaking vessel. The token, the small, personal item that a person clings to, was, in Jackson's eyes, the only key to their true essence. The children of Port Oswald whispered his name in the shadows of the alleys, their voices shaking as they jumped rope to a rhyme that promised a glass eternity to anyone whose ribbon caught the oak man's eye. He was the shadow in the fog, the self-appointed archivist of a city that was already a graveyard. As the years stretched into decades, the house on the cliffs, a jagged structure of salt-cracked wood and rusted iron, became a cathedral of sterile terror. It was to this house that Eva was brought. She was a creature of the inland meadows, a girl who carried the scent of clover, rain, and wide-open spaces where the fog was a stranger. Her arrival in Port Oswald had been like a flicker of candlelight in a coal mine. Her laughter was soft, her steps unhurried, and for a few months, the house on the cliff seemed to breathe. But Jackson had not acquired her for love. Love was a vibration he had long ago deemed inconvenient. To him, Eva was a curator, a necessary set of hands to tend to the silence he was meticulously building. The ritual began almost immediately, a slow erosion of her soul that he called the liturgy of the bleach. Every morning, before the sun could even attempt to pierce the factory breath, the air inside the house would become a chemical weapon, sterile, cold, and sharp with the scent of ammonia. Eva's hands, once soft and smelling of lavender, grew raw and cracked. The skin peeled away in thin, translucent strips, revealing the red, weeping vulnerability beneath. She was forced to scrub the floorboards until they shone with a lifeless, bone-white glare that reflected nothing but her own exhaustion. "The wood must be white, Eva," Jackson would say, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house. "Dust is a sin. Dust is the herald of decay. Dust is the noise of the world trying to get back in. Cleanliness is the only thing that keeps the archive quiet." The rooms began to smell of nothing but chemicals and despair. The boards reflected the gray sky outside, but it was a sky seen through a veil of bleach. Eva became a ghost haunting her own kitchen, her voice fracturing into staccato whispers that mimicked the rhythmic hiss of the steam pipes. She was a machine of soap and sorrow, watched by her young son, Leo. The boy did not cry when he saw his mother's bleeding hands. He did not scream when his father's shadow fell over the room. He observed. He was the first and only student in the school of shadow, learning with every passing day that the erasure of the human soul was not a sudden act, but a slow, methodical process of filing. One night, the bleach had not yet reached the deepest part of Eva's spirit. She stood by the window, staring out at the invisible meadows of her youth, her voice a heartbreakingly human tremor in the sterile air. "If I'm clean enough, Jackson, if I scrub until the wood turns to bone, will you let me go back? I just want to feel the grass under my feet. I just want to see something green one last time before I forget what the color looks like." Jackson's fingers traced the line of her jaw with the cold reverence of a man measuring a rare specimen for a display case. "The meadows rot, Eva. They wither, they turn to muck, and they are forgotten. But here, in the jars I am preparing, you will be eternal. You will be a symbol. Why would you ever want to go back to being a person when you could be a masterpiece of stillness?" That was the night the last spark died in Eva's green eyes. She became a rhythm, scrub, rinse, repeat. Her body was reduced to a tool of labor, her mind to a fragment of what it had been. Leo listened to the sound of his mother's despair, the way her words fractured like glass. He understood then with the terrible clarity of a child raised in darkness, that his family was not living. They were merely being filed away, one scrubbed floorboard at a time. The city outside continued to exhale its yellow mist, oblivious to the archive growing within the house on the cliff. New souls continued to arrive in Port Oswald, drawn by the false promise of work in the factories or the desperate hope of starting over. Among them was Elena. Elena was 22, and she arrived with a warmth that the fog couldn't quite extinguish. Her eyes were the color of a Mediterranean storm, and her laughter carried the echoes of a village she would never see again. She came with nothing but a worn book of poetry and a dream. She wanted to teach the dockside children how to read. She wanted to give them words that could act as lanterns, words that could pierce the factory breath and show them a world beyond the soot. She lived in a crumbling boarding house near the harbor, a structure where the wallpaper peeled away in long, skin-like strips and the floorboards groaned under the weight of 1,000 sorrows. Yet every single night, Elena would light a single candle. Its flame was a fragile, tiny spark of defiant orange against the suffocating, oily dark of Port Oswald. She would hum her mother's lullaby, a melody about a golden bird that never stopped flying, a bird that lived in the sun. It was a song of pure rebellion. Neighbors would sometimes pause in the drafty hallway outside her door, drawn to the sound like moths to a dying flame. In a city where silence was the law of survival, her voice was a revolutionary act. Jackson Ryder watched her for 3 days. He stood in the shadows of the alleyway across from her boarding house, his eyes never blinking, his mind already categorizing her. To him, Elena was not a woman. She was a glass bird. She was a soul unclaimed, a vibrant, noisy chapter that was crying out to be filed into his archive of silence. On the 4th night, as the fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a slow, suffocating tide of gray wool, he stepped into her light. He offered her a cigarette, his voice low and rhythmic, sounding like the heavy, deliberate turning of ancient, vellum pages. "The world is far too loud for a spirit as quiet as yours. Elena," he whispered, the words vibrating in the small room. "I have a library that needs a voice. I have a sanctuary where things are kept safe, where the world, with all its hunger and its noise, can never touch them again. Loneliness and hunger are predators just as fierce as any man." Elena looked at him, her eyes searching his cold, serene face for a sign of danger, but she found only the promise of stillness. She followed him to the threshold, a jagged, rocky point on the black sands where the Atlantic roared like a trapped, wounded beast. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks, spraying salt and ice into the freezing air. Elena did not plead for her life when the moment came. She was a poet, and she understood the weight of an ending. She looked at the dark horizon and whispered the final line of her mother's lullaby. Her voice was a small, trembling thread of gold in the darkness, but it did not break. When the ritual was over, Jackson Ryder did not take her life in the way other men committed murder. He took her ending and made it his own. He snipped the red silk ribbon from her hair, the only thing she had brought from her village that still held the color of life. He buried her body in the iron-rich, black silt of the cove, where the salt would preserve her bones. But the ribbon, the symbol, he placed in a hand-blown glass jar. He returned to his cellar and labeled the jar in his rigid, iron bar script, the letters looking like the cage they were, Elena. Chapter 1. The Unread Poem. The symbol remains. Back at the boarding house, her candle burned down to a pool of cold, gray wax. The neighbors who had once paused to listen to her song now passed her door quickly, their eyes fixed on the floor. The children no longer whispered about the girl with the golden bird. They began to whisper about the man who kept the ribbons in the dark. The disappearances began to form a pattern, a map of loss that only one man in the city was desperate enough to see. Detective Elias Thorne was a man who was himself becoming an archive of pain. His lungs were failing him, ravaged by the very factory breath he had spent his life breathing. He carried a heavy oxygen tank that hissed with every step he took, a mechanical, rhythmic echo of the city's own wheezing. His chest was a hollow cage of rattling bone, and the white handkerchiefs he carried were constantly stained with the bright red evidence of his own decay. But Thorne's eyes were fixed on the wall of the unclaimed. In the basement of the precinct, he had created an altar to the missing. Dozens of photographs were pinned in rows, their eyes staring out from the fog, demanding an answer. Every night, Thorne would sit before them, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his weak hand as he whispered to the cold, damp plaster, "Just one more month. Just give me enough breath to find the man who turns people into glass. I won't let my city become his cellar. I won't let them be forgotten." The younger detectives at the precinct mocked him. They called him the ghost with a badge, and they laughed at his obsession, believing it to be the madness of a dying man. But Thorne knew the truth wasn't hidden in the official reports. It was hidden in the silence that followed every disappearance. One storm-choked night, the city of Port Oswald finally screamed back. Mary, a factory worker with a voice that usually rang out like a brass bell above the din of the machines, fought against the fog. She didn't go quietly. Thorne, who was patrolling the edge of the Blackwood forest, heard her cry. It was a sharp, metallic sound, a defiance that cut through the mist. Thorne plunged into the forest, his flashlight beam scattering against the sulphurous mist like a broken star. The forest was a labyrinth of black, skeletal trees and brambles that clawed at his coat. His boots sank into the freezing mud, and every breath felt like a jagged blade in his throat. He followed the sound, thud, 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 the sound of heavy, deliberate boots striking the damp earth. He was chasing a shadow that seemed to move through the trees without touching them. At the edge of a deep, jagged ravine, he finally caught a glimpse of the Oak Man. Jackson Ryder stood at the edge of the void, perfectly calm. He held Mary's silver earring in his gloved hand, a tiny, glittering glint of defiance against the dark. "Stop! In the name of every soul you've erased," Thorne roared, his voice raw and fueled by the blood in his throat. Jackson didn't run. He turned slowly, his face serene in the flashlight's beam. "You are chasing the wind, detective," he said, his voice vibrating from the ground beneath Thorne's feet. "The girls aren't gone. They're merely filed away. I'm the only one who has ever truly listened to them. Why fight the inevitable? The world is a loud, messy place, Thorne. In my archive, they are safe. The symbol remains." Thorne was seized by a coughing fit so violent it dropped him to his knees. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as blood spilled onto the forest floor. By the time he could lift his head, the shadow was gone. Only the silver earring remained, caught in a thorn bush like a metallic tear. Thorne returned to the precinct and pinned the earring beneath Mary's photograph. "I saw his face," he whispered to the wall, "and I will end him before I take my last breath." In the house on the cliff, the atmosphere was shifting again. Jackson had brought in a new caretaker, Maya. Maya was not like Eva. She had been forged in the fires of Balkan wars. A woman whose hands carried the physical scars of survival and whose eyes had seen predators walk in the daylight of burned-out villages. She came to Port Oswald not as a victim, but as a survivor seeking a quiet place to hide her own ghosts. She had been hired to tend to Eva, who was now little more than a skeletal machine of bleach and soap, her mind entirely lost to the liturgy. Maya saw the jars in the cellar almost immediately. She saw the obsessive, geometric precision with which they were arranged. She saw Leo, now a teenager, moving with the same predatory stillness as his father, his eyes already beginning to look at the world as a collection of parts. She began to speak to Leo in the hours when Jackson was away, hunting in the fog. Her voice was firm, human, and vibrantly alive. "Leo, look at your mother. Her scrubbing is not a chore. It is a scream that no one will hear. Your father isn't a savior, boy. He is a thief. He is stealing the most precious thing a person has, their ending. A life without an ending is not eternal. It is just a ghost. You are made of flesh and blood, Leo. Don't let him turn you into glass. Leo was torn between the only world he had ever known and the fire he saw in Maya's eyes. He had been raised to worship the archive, but Maya's words were like a torch held to a wall of ice. Jackson sensed the contamination of Maya's presence. She was too loud. She sang while she cooked. She talked to Eva as if she were still a person. He began preparing her jar, a large, hand-blown vessel of exquisite clarity. He labeled it in his rigid script, Maya, the final defiance. But Maya was a soldier. She found Jackson's hidden ledger inside a hollowed-out Victorian clock, a book of names, dates, and the tokens he had stolen. She descended into the cellar and saw the rows of jars. She saw Elena's ribbon, Mary's earring, and finally, the empty jar with her own name on it. When Jackson appeared at the top of the stairs, the struggle was not the clinical, silent ritual he had practiced for years. It was a war. Maya did not go to the Black Sands. She fought him in the very heart of his archive. She shattered the jars. She broke the glass that held the stolen memories. She took a shard of Elena's jar and carved a deep, jagged line of truth across Jackson's cheek, drawing the first dark, thick blood he had shed in decades. "Break the chain, Leo!" she screamed as Jackson's massive hand closed around her throat. "Remember the ending. Don't let him file you away." The cellar door slammed shut, and the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. That night, the furnace in the Ryder house roared with such intensity that the black smoke rising over Port Oswald carried the scent of a defiance that refused to be filed. Leo Ryder stood in the hallway, holding the gold ring Maya had flicked toward him as she fought. It was heavy. It was real. It was an ending. He realized in that moment that silence was not a law of nature. It was a choice made by those too afraid to speak. The final act did not come with the drama of a chase, but with the cold, methodical precision of a raid. Detective Elias Thorne led the technicians into the house. He moved through the rooms with his oxygen tank hissing like a dying dragon, his eyes fixed on the man who sat in the parlor. They found Eva first. She was still on her knees, her fingers raw and bleeding, scrubbing a single tile of the parlor floor. "Is it white yet?" she whispered to the detectives, her eyes vacant. "I just want to see the meadows. He promised me the meadows if I was clean enough." Thorne knelt beside her, his own breath rattling in his chest. "Eva, the silence is broken. You don't have to scrub anymore. The meadows are waiting." In the cellar, they found the wreckage of the archive. They found the jars that had survived Maya's struggle. 42 lives reduced to tokens. Elena's ribbon, Mary's earring, Maya's ring. Jackson Ryder sat at the center of the room, his hands interlaced, his face perfectly calm despite the blood on his cheek. He looked at Thorne and smiled, a slow, terrifying expression of pure certainty. "You haven't won, detective. You've merely disturbed the collection. In my cellar, they were safe. They were masterpieces. Now, they're just junk in an evidence locker. You are the one who has truly erased them." The trial was a spectacle that Port Oswald would never forget. For 6 months, the city was forced to look into the jars. The tokens were matched to the missing. The wall of the unclaimed was finally dismantled, photograph by photograph. Jackson Ryder was sentenced to death, a decision that was met with a silence more profound than any he had ever created. On the morning of the execution, a fog so thick it swallowed the prison walls rolled in from the Atlantic. Jackson walked to the chair with the mechanical grace of a clockwork man. He leaned toward his son, who stood behind the glass, and whispered a final, chilling creed. "The silence is not broken, Leo. It is inherited. The archive always grows. The symbol remains." At 5:01 a.m., the switch was thrown. The lights in the district flickered and died for 3 long minutes. For those 3 minutes, Port Oswald was a void. When the power returned, the jar man was gone. 20 years have passed. The Port Oswald of today tries to pretend it has forgotten. Luxury lofts with floor-to-ceiling windows now stand where the soot-choked factories once bled into the sky. The docks have been cleaned, and the factory breath has been replaced by the smell of expensive coffee and salt air perfume. Tourists stroll the harbor, buying postcards of the historic fog, unaware of the bones that rest in the iron-rich silt beneath the cobblestones. But memory in this city is like rust. It clings to everything. Leo Ryder is now the city's chief archivist. He is a man of immense respect, a man who knows every birth, every death, and every secret ever recorded in the city's history. He lives in a penthouse that is a masterpiece of perfect order. There is no dust. There is no chaos. The air is always sharp with the scent of lemon, lye, and cold, clinical precision. At night, when the city of Port Oswald is asleep, Leo sits at his mahogany desk. He takes out a single, hand-blown glass jar. Inside rests Maya's gold ring. He takes a piece of white tape and, in a handwriting that is identical to his father's rigid, iron bar script, he writes, "Legacy." He looks into the mirror, and he doesn't see a man who has escaped the past. He sees a curator of the void. He understands now what his father meant, that the world is too loud, too messy, too fragile to be left to its own devices. He touches the empty jars that line his walls, his fingers tracing the cold glass with a reverence that is both beautiful and terrifying. The city outside hums with new life, trains, neon lights, and a laughter of people who think they are free. But Leo Ryder knows better. He hears the rhythm of the jars. He hears the wheezing of the city's lungs. He does not need to speak, for he knows that silence is the only thing that truly endures. Port Oswald has changed its face, but its soul is a collection. The fog still presses against the windows, a loyal sentinel. The archive still grows. The morning is honest. The future is present. The symbol remains. Port Oswald may change its face, but its soul is a collection. The fog still presses against the glass. The archive still grows, and the shadow collector always remains. This is Unclosed, where stories begin, but never truly end. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until we meet again, good night.